Welcome back to ADM+S in Conversation. In a recent announcement, Meta, the parent company of some of the world's largest social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram, has revealed it will be ending its third-party fact-checking program in the United States, which was introduced during a period of heightened concern around information integrity in 2016. Now, instead of relying on professional fact-checkers to moderate content, the tech giant will adopt a community notes program, similar to the one used by X. This decision has sparked debate over free speech, censorship, and the ongoing fight against the spread of mis- and disinformation online. And who better to talk to about these issues than a real expert on the topic? Dr Silvia Montana-Nino is an associate investigator at the centre, where her current research focuses on the automation, datification, and platformisation of global news outlets and fact-checking organisations. She is interested in the impacts of technology on journalism and is joining me today to talk about some of the broader implications of Meta's decision. Silvia, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Natalie, to you for this invitation and also to the ADM+S.
So, firstly, Silvia, could you just elaborate a little bit on what fact-checking system has been in place at Meta over the last several years?
So, Meta launched this independent third-party fact-checking program in 2016, and it did so during a period of a heightened concern about information integrity that coincided with the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president, and all this furor about the role of social media platforms in spreading misinformation and disinformation. And so, as part of the program, what Meta does is funding these fact-checking partners. Usually, these fact-checking partners are accredited organizations by the International Fact-Checking Network. So you can find organizations such as Reuters Fact Check or the Australian Associated Press, of the AFP, PolitiFact in the US, also here in Australia, AFP. So they are like independent organizations that assess the validity of viral and consequential content posted on these platforms. And they pay a sum of money for each claim identified and debunked. And so how the system works is really straightforward. So the fact checkers select the problematic information, they process this professionally, they issue a verdict. And so in those posts that are like more like viral, the platform just put some warning labels attached to this content deemed to be inaccurate or misleading. And this helps users to be better informed about the content they are about to share or see online. And so this content is allegedly downgraded by the platform. Say this is inaccurate. And so this is how a program works. There's been so much controversy about how the Meta program emphasizes content rather than actors. For example, in the Meta fact-checking policies, fact-checkers are suggested to fact-check users in general instead of politicians, celebrities, and this being like a matter of controversy between these organizations and Meta itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously this system was brought in as somewhat of a solution to the problem of misinformation. And now this decision to drop the model, what are some of the reasons that Meta has cited for doing so?
Yes, officially, Zuckerberg has emphasized ideological reasons. For example, in the video that he published in past weeks, he mentioned that Meta is returning to its roots and is going to prioritize free speech, even if this speech poses potential harms for specific communities. He has also cited concerns over the alleged political bias of fact-checkers. However, there are indeed underlying political factors at play, particularly if we see the inauguration of the Trump administration, where all the big tech companies are aligned now with the current Trump administration. But in the past, mainly, the Republicans in the US have consistently criticized fact-checking and platform moderation. So mainly like ideological and political reasons. But the dominant story then is like, and it's particularly a narrative from the conservatives, is that fact-checking is biased and that fact-checkers were fact-checking politically, despite Meta's policies and also the IFCN principles. That's the narrative or the answer from Zuckerberg.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you're someone who's been researching in this space for several years now. And since this decision has come out, there's been all kinds of commentary and I guess backlash on the topic. How important do you think fact checking is for today's information environment?
Yeah, that I think fact checking is so important because the first thing is that it's evolving into a very interesting way of correcting or verifying information as has been traditionally done in journalism. There are like new philosophical questions for fact checking organizations these days. And I think one of the main things that fact checkers are doing, and this is a little bit like answering this question about a free expression and responsibility to combat misinformation or online, is that one of the central criteria that journalists and fact checkers assess today is this potential harm that misinformation and disinformation can cause. So when selecting this problematic content, fact checkers consider a series of questions that, for example, evaluate different types of risks or social harms. For instance, during the pandemic, misinformation about vaccinations pose a serious risk to life and death of people. And so fact checkers evolved during these times into a more sort of like harm or public health reason to be or to do fact checking. And so it's evolving and it's becoming really important and is sort of like aligned with this responsible approach to freedom of expression. So this is something that has been incorporated in a very interesting way because fact-checking is becoming indirectly in a soft moderation practice for the big tech platforms. So they are completely relevant for platforms. For the past years, fact checkers work in cooperation with these big tech platforms, for example, working with their infrastructure, with the data tools. So it was like a very important integration or like an apparatus of truth keeping. And this is to say that this is an apparatus that is currently in crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of touches on something else that I wanted to ask you, this point about other big tech companies following suit. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit some of those broader implications of Meta's decision, considering the huge role that it has played in supporting fact-checking initiatives, particularly.
Yes, there are like broader implications and pretty serious implications, particularly for vulnerable and minority users on these platforms, including LGBTQ plus people, immigrants, women, as well as indigenous people and people of color. Meta also now permits content that was previously restricted. So there are like many changes happening, and these content policy changes, together with the move to a community node system of content moderation, means that a more harmful content will circulate, and even more extreme content that falls outside of the policy will take longer to be flagged as harmful or as to be reduced in exposure. Also, I would say that with this, without the Meta funding, there are like other implications because fact checkers will likely be hampered in their efforts to counter attempts to weaponize fact checking by other actors. This is something that is happening. For example, Russian President Vladimir Putin recently announced that he's going to establish a state fact checking network following Russian values, and there are like big group of countries following this membership that Putin is created. And so this is contrasting with the ways in which accredited organizations in Western and other regions of the world work, which are the International Fact-Checking Network Code of Principles. So there are like many broad implications there. for people, for fact-checking organizations, for the growth of the field, implications for democratic processes, implications in terms of how we understand responsible and freedom of expression paradigms of information. Or this is big.
Oh, the list goes on. I mean, given the huge role that platforms play in today's information, landscape, the fact that they don't want to support these organizations, do you see a lot of them closing down because of that financial burden that they'll now face? Or
If you see the reports of the IFCN about the current funding and financial situation of fact checkers, meta partnerships constitute around 45% of the total income for fact checkers.
wow, that's huge.
Yes. So, but we expect that with this new package of measures, fact checkers are going to be like more independent now from what platforms want them to be in their content moderation approaches.
I'm interested because the decision's been made to roll this system out starting in the United States. Has there been any kind of conversation about an evaluation of how the new model is working before it rolls out in other countries around the world? Or is it really just a matter of time?
There's no evaluation at the moment about whether these measures are going to affect other regions of the world. But this is going to be important for other organizations because they depend, as I mentioned before, on meta platforms. And so it's going to be like a shake for these platforms to consider like, okay, what we would do in case these measures are affecting at a more like a wider extent.
Well, we're now going to jump across and start talking about the community notes model. What are some of the current evaluations around this system that's being used by X at the moment? And could this model be prone to manipulation?
Well, yes. So the community notes model is a model that has been traditionally implemented on X, formerly Twitter. And so this system has been both praised and criticized for its approach to content moderation, because while it aims to provide user-driven fact-checking and context, it has several problems and limitations. For example, when it's about to identify a manipulation or a coordinated attacks, the system, for example, can be gamed by groups of users that are interested in suppressing certain narratives. Also, there has been research about this non-expert crowdsourced model tends to be biased, and it tends to have like issues in terms of ideologically skewing the selection. So since users determine what gets flagged and what is considered helpful, there is like a majority bias that can shape which nodes gain this visibility. So there are like political and other groups that use the system to reinforce these viewpoints rather than, being interested in correcting or verifying information.
And when you say contributors, can anyone go online and be a moderator?
Yes, definitely. You need to comply by specific norms. You need to have a specific number of followers, a specific number of votes. They need to meet certain activities thresholds on the platform. So definitely there are like some conditions, but the fact that it's a crowdsourced model also implies that there is like it's a collective interest, but there is like a lack of expert oversight on misinformation. So
Completely.
another problem that the community notes has is that it is like inconsistent in its coverage. So it's applied selectively, and that means that many misleading posts never receive a note, especially if they don't attract enough users' attention. There is also a problem in terms of like the delay in addressing misinformation. So it takes time for enough contributors to review and vote on a note before this note appears in the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So during major break news events, for example, misinformation can spread widely before any corrections are added.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm kind of wondering. So if anyone can go online and be a content moderator, I guess, is there then any check in place to see what kinds of content is being elevated or being squashed, I guess, in the newsfeed?
Well, there is research that suggests that what is elevated is what is aligned with the political beliefs of people doing the fact check. So this is something that first research on community notes show.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, depending on some of the outcomes of these research questions, how likely would Meta be to go back on the decision if they really found that it was not working?
Well, I think the question is not now about the model, but how any fact-checking model has political implications. And so if it's not proven that community notes has probably less efficacy, platforms are going to play the game of like, okay, just like keep this model because it works for us. It works for big actors interested in omitting fact-checking, professional fact-checking practices. And so I don't think so. And for the US, at least during this administration, because it's a matter of interest, of profit, and political interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, now we're going to change our perspective because we've been talking a lot about the platforms and now we're going to talk a little bit about the users. How do you see this decision impacting public trust of the platforms? And do you predict this will impact user activity?
Yes, I think trust in platforms is a growing problem, as well as trust in media. Because at the end of the day, big tech platforms are corporations that are profiting from the attention economy and sort of like a proprietary algorithmic practices. I think trust is like a hugely impact among users. And as you can see, and this happened in past months, many users are migrating to different platforms. Important organizations, universities, outlets are migrating. So trust in platforms definitely needs to be constructed around different new measures. For example, algorithmic audits or data transparency is really important for researchers, for citizens, for even people engaged in community notes models of fact checking. And so there are like specific things that need to be sort of enhanced with this trust crisis that we have.
Well, I did want to ask you, so you've worked as a journalist for many years, and I've been sitting here thinking, how has this experience in the industry kind of shaped your research interest and I guess your passion for this topic?
Yes, I was interested in fact checking as a journalist because fact checking has changed. Like traditionally, when you talk about fact checking as a journalist, you think it's like, okay, this is the backbone of the profession. This is our method. But fact checking is becoming more than a journalistic task. It's becoming an important part of platform moderation. It has an important role in identifying problematic practices on platforms, coordinated actions, detecting propaganda, detecting also this rise of hate speech. Is an important way of keeping our trust in democracy, in political actors, and other areas of our social lives. So it's like how this journalism, digital journalism, has changed our ideas of the profession.
I mean, what do you think comes next for fact checkers?
This
Where
is
does this
something
go?
that we have tried to talk with different organizations. Now, well, fact-checking organizations are changing towards like automating some parts of the process. So they are working now with organizations, with stakeholders in the technology industry to be able to automate the repetitive parts of fact checking. So maybe there is like a repositioning in terms of like how these fact checkers are going to work and to develop their own culture of technology with these other companies.
I'm interested, like it's funny to hear you say that in the context of fact checking, if one of the previous criticisms has been about bias, and now we're talking about automating some of these systems as a solution to that. Well, we know that there's bias in generative AI models. You know, these models are trained on data. So is the discourse around that at the moment that the outputs will be more trustworthy or that they won't be?
Well, there's a big research question.
Yeah, maybe I need to do a PhD.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that is emerging now in research. So how platforms are going to use this previously verified claims to train the algorithms and automate in a way fact-checking. But this is really impossible because fact-checking also acts on very specific contextual situations. So fact-checking in the US is also different from fact-checking in Latin America, from Chequeado, from other organizations working with their own political contexts. So definitely it's not something that it can be automated.
Yeah, it definitely seems counterproductive. Well, you've answered all of my questions, Silvia. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation before we wrap up?
I think we are facing really challenging times with fact checking in next 4 years because it's likely that many of the companies are following Meta's initiatives and new political approach to fact checking. And this is something that is happening now, for example, with Google. Google recently announced that they are not going to include fact checks in their search results. So difficult times are coming. Misinformation is going to be wider a challenge for our democracies. So today I'm very pessimistic. The panorama is not optimistic.
Yes, I think that's completely valid. I guess it'll be interesting for us to stay tuned and see what findings do come out of the research that's been done on this topic.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this chat, Silvia. It's been great to have you on this episode of In Conversation.
Thanks, Natalie.